I've always been upfront that my views on crime are hardline. I would personally describe them as conservative. Although I'm centrist, this is one area where I'm conservative. I'm open about that. And my basis for that is because I do think that judicial punishment has an important place in justice, as opposed to more left leaning people whose big focus is always rehabilitation. I fundamentally disagree with the notion that punishment is somehow punitive or it has no place. And I think when it comes to crime and justice, that is one of the left's big Achilles heels. Um, I think a lot of left leaning people, their knee jerk reaction to crime is about rehabilitation and about the background and all that, rather than considering a heinous act has happened, the perpetrator has to be held to account for it. Um, so I do diverge with them on that issue, absolutely. But I don't need to keep repeating myself about that. I mention it in every video on the subject. This one I want to be a little bit more specific. I want to talk about the penal system, because although I consider myself hardline on crime, I'm probably not as hardline as some people. I mean, I'm not comfortable with the idea of the death penalty. I don't think we should bring it back. Like I've said in the previous video, if there's a mistake with the death penalty, there's no turning around. And we know that innocent people have went to the gallows in this country. Actually, just by coincidence, it's just past 60 years now since the death penalty was formally abolished in the United Kingdom. The last executions were 61 years ago, 1964. I don't think it's something we should go back to, but I do think we need tougher punishments in some areas. Now, with that sort of hardline approach that I have, people might be surprised at what I'm going to talk about in this video. I believe in proportionately tough punishment, but that doesn't mean that I believe prisons should be hellholes. It doesn't mean that I believe in brutality for the sake of it. I don't believe in treating criminals exactly the same way they treat their victims, because that would be revenge. It would just be revenge rather than justice. And I think brutalising criminals, no matter how despicable they may be, doesn't say it's not a good reflection of society. So I think they should be punished but not brutalised. Let me explain what I mean by that. If someone's committed a heinous crime, I think they should spend a very long time behind bars, and if it's a particularly heinous crime, I think it should be a whole life tariff. I don't think they should ever be freed. I think some people can't be rehabilitated. One such individual who I think most people would agree is a despicable example of a criminal is the musician Ian Watkins of the band Lost Prophets. He, and I'm not going to go into too many details here because it's a sensitive subject nature. I also don't want to be demonetized. But the basic outline of the case is he was convicted of heinous child sexual offences. One of the presiding officers in the case said it was some of the worst he's ever seen. And I believe the judge in the case said he was an organised paedophile. This is a despicable character. He done some horrendous, sickening things that any sane person should be disgusted by. And the long sentence that he got, 29 years I believe it was justified, because this wasn't looking at images online, which is bad enough. This was actually prolific predatory behaviour. Sickening stuff. And like I said, I'm not going to go into the details. But he was murdered in Wakefield Prison earlier this year. Now, predictably, when he was murdered, there were people cheering it and putting like emojis and heart emojis and all the rest of it, as in, oh, this is wonderful, no big loss, good riddance. So, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to be misunderstood. My reaction is, well, indeed, it's no big loss. He was a despicable character. And, certainly for his victims, that would be perhaps a relief. But my first reaction on hearing about prison vigilantism is not triumphalist. And the reason it's not is because that suggests a system under pressure. It suggests a system or the prison staff are not in control, or at least it could be a whole range of things. It could be corruption, it could be prison staff having lost control, it could be a culture of violence going on inside. The prison that he was held at was Wakefield, which is, I understand, a maximum security prison. You know, it's where some really, really bad offenders go to. There's a similar one not far from where I live, HMP Frankland, outside Durham City, which is sometimes called Monster Mansion, which gives you an idea of the sort of people that are held inside. Anyway, there's an obvious fact with something like this. People assume that the murderers of Ian Watkins, apparently there's two men are being held for this. When it's on the inside, that's always, you know, there's a philosophy of, well, if someone's serving a whole life tariff anyway, what have they got to lose? But there is ways of, you know, transferring them and so on. My reaction is, well, wait a second, they're also in a maximum security prison. These guys, it hasn't been published what their crimes are because there is an ongoing case. But I guarantee you they will not be saints. It's highly likely they will themselves be murderers or predators or serious criminals, because they're not going to be in a prison like that if they're not. So people sort of treating them like heroes. I've seen comments like they should get a medal and stuff, because people's reaction is, well, they've killed a despicable character. But that doesn't mean that they're good people. It doesn't mean that they're saints. What about their innocent victims? Don't forget, they're in prison for a reason. They will have had innocent victims. That's why I don't really join the bandwagon of being triumphant when I hear of this sort of prison vigilantism. Very often it's aimed at sex offenders, rapists, and particularly paedophiles. Sometimes you know, there's that cliche about police officers in prison. They're also probably targeted. Sometimes you get sectarian and racist stuff, but particularly, you know, what would be seen as vulnerable prisoners are sexual offenders. I watched a documentary a few years ago about the Strange Ways prison riot in Manchester, and apparently during that violence there was reports that the wing housing the sex offenders was particularly under assault. Now, there is a lot of people out there who really won't care. They'll say, well, whatever, they get what they deserve. And you know what, maybe they do. But I just can't get on board with the idea of prison vigilantism, because I think that it doesn't demonstrate justice, it demonstrates a loss of control of the system. I don't take any pleasure from the idea that a burglar kills a rapist, or a rapist kills another rapist, or a terrorist kills a paedophile, or a paedophile kills another sex offender. These are all bad people. None of them are people who should be admired or, you know, applauded. And we're not even entirely sure this attack on Ian Watkins, it may well have been because of his crimes. It may also have just been a dispute within the prison, you know, over paraphernalia brought in. Apparently he was found with a phone, for example. It may not necessarily be because of his crimes. But the point I'm making here is it taps into a wider issue about penal reform and the way prisons are. Sometimes we hear that British prisons are a picnic. I don't think that's true. I mean, there were over 400 deaths in prisons in the last calendar year. I don't think British prisons are a picnic, actually. But frankly, they shouldn't be. What I ideally would like to see is a prison that is tough but humane. And what I mean by that is, I don't think prisoners should get any perks. I don't think that there should be extensive, for example, access to television or books, perhaps. But I mean, I know there was a program somewhere, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was. I think it was actually somewhere in North America. But the logic was, I'm probably wrong about that. It was, I can't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, the logic was for every book that the inmate read, they get a day or a week off their sentence. Now I'm thinking, well, okay, but so they're demonstrating that they want to learn about the world and so on, but they've still committed a crime. I'm not sure I agree with that. principle, because it's basically, if an offender's clever, then they can have a reduced sentence. That's what it sounds like to me. If they're assertive enough to just read, oh well, I've murdered someone, but I'm going to get potentially a long time taken off. I'm not on board with that. But what I'd ideally like to see is a system that is not just 12 hours a day of doing nothing, having some production going on in prison, perhaps education, yes, perhaps a literature side of it as well, perhaps learning skills. I can understand that. But what I don't want to see is perks. I don't think inmates should get access to television. You know, that's something that law-abiding citizens enjoy. They shouldn't have access to it. Why? Why should that be something that they get to enjoy? In the case of young offenders institutes, we hear of days out. Why should they get a day out when they have, in some cases, taken a life? So I don't believe that there should be those sort of perks inside. But I don't want prisons to look like... I don't think they should be so brutal that it's just inhumane. You know, where they're so overcrowded. I mean, you see parts of Latin America, they're like human battery farms. You know, that's not something I think should be replicated. A lot of people hail the president of El Salvador. They say, you know, he's cracked down on crime. I would say, you know, if I was a Salvadorian, I'd probably welcome that, because there's notoriously high crime rates and people need to look at that context. But my concern about that situation is, how do we know that all of those people are definitely guilty? How do we know there hasn't been people picked up being in the wrong place at the wrong time and had nothing to do with gangs? People don't know that. So like I say, this is a very emotive subject, but you can have a system inside with a sort of rehabilitation going on inside, education and so on, but there shouldn't be frills. And I think the people in charge should be the prison staff and the governors, not the inmates. The problem with vigilantism is people might say, oh, well, this real lowlife is being killed. It's no big loss. And I'm certainly not going to lose any sleep over the death of someone like Watkins. Despicable, evil individual. But that doesn't mean that the person or people who killed him deserve to be praised. They're still murderers. You know, the old expression, two wrongs don't make a right, or, you know, they will have been in that prison in the first place. It hasn't been published, like I say, what their offences are, but I guarantee you they will not be in there for stealing a chocolate bar from a shop. They will be in that prison for a very serious offence in the first place, which means they have innocent victims on the outside. So I think it's kind of in bad taste and disrespectful to victims of crime to praise violent prisons just because they're attacking unpopular prisoners. I don't think... I see nothing to celebrate about anarchy inside prisons. I don't think prisons should be particularly nice places, but I don't think they should be brutal either. I think that inmates, you know, should have exercise, they should have dietary requirements if they're allergic, etc. And I don't think bullying should be encouraged. I think that prison governors and staff have to have control, and I think in recent years their morale has been very, very low. I think there's recruiting issues. I think the overcrowding issue is definitely a problem. For me, the answer to that is build more prisons. It's not release more people, it's build more prisons. And of course it will be expensive. Nothing when it comes to justice doesn't involve money in some way, but easing pressure on the system and having a working penal system surely would be better than having a system where people are being released and then they just go and commit more crime. So that's how I see it. Let me know your thoughts. I appreciate not everyone will agree with this. Some people will say, oh, but Nathan, who cares if inmates are killing each other? This is not about trying to advocate sympathy for someone like Ian Watkins. I think it's despicable, horrendous things that he done. And his death is probably no big loss. But murder is still murder, and if we as a society say, well, as long as there's bad people being taken out, it's fine, I think it desensitizes society. And I think that if we say it's okay to have a brutal system inside, I suppose it's better inside than outside. I suppose it's better than having violent criminals running wild, but no, I just can't get on board with it. I never have been able to. I do think that some criminals, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you get some young offenders who are remorseless, they're arrogant. I think that if they were to see, for example, an adult prison, it might knock them down a peg or two, and they might think, this is no picnic, this isn't going to be fun, this is not the way I want to have my life. So that's how I see it. I just can't get on the bandwagon of, celebration. As far as I'm concerned, a bad man has died, but that doesn't mean that his killers should be celebrated. They're still killers, or killer, depending on. I understand too. Other inmates are being tried for this. Let me know your thoughts.